Arthur gave away the last thing he had. $13. That was it. That was all that stood between his 7-year-old daughter and going to bed hungry, and he handed it to a stranger in a dark alley without a moment's hesitation. That sounds insane, unless you understand the kind of day he just survived. He walked out of the hospital with $13, a badge no one bothered to take back, and 4 miles of rain standing between him and his daughter's birthday cake.
I know.
Then, he saw her.
Who is
A
she?
woman, neatly dressed, trembling, sitting on the wet concrete outside a convenience store, empty-handed, with nowhere to go. So he spent every last dollar he had. All of it. He walked home in the rain, empty-handed. What he didn't know was that this single act of kindness was about to change his life forever. Before we find out what happens next, what these characters have been through, and where this story is going, it would mean a lot if you'd take a second to like this and leave a comment below. Tell us what you're thinking. Tell us what you're feeling. Tell us which character already has a piece of your heart. We'd love to hear from you. Now let's get back to the story. Arthur Callum Reed was 31 years old, and he had never been late to work in his life. Not once. Not for illness, not for grief, not for the 2 years after Sarah died, when getting out of bed felt like lifting something that had no handle. He showed up because showing up was the one thing he could still control. And control, quiet, unglamorous, entirely invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for it, was how Arthur Reed had held his life together since he was 17 years old, and had understood, clearly and permanently, that no one was coming to hold it for him. He was a biomedical technician, senior grade ATA, 8 years at City General Hospital, which was the longest he'd stayed anywhere and the closest thing he had to an identity outside of fatherhood. He knew every laser surgical unit in that building the way other men knew their children's faces. Serial numbers, maintenance cycles, degradation patterns, the particular sound a misaligned resonator made at 40% output. He had rebuilt 3 units from near failure with his own hands. He had written the inspection protocols the entire department still used, and had never once put his name on them, because that was not the kind of man he was. He was not the kind of man who stole things either. The accusation arrived on a Tuesday morning in an envelope with the hospital's letterhead, formal, efficient, and entirely false. 3 laser surgical units, replaced with reconditioned components, resold through an unlicensed third party. His access codes on every record. And now he was standing in the middle of the main hall at 6:45 in the morning, in front of every colleague he had eaten lunch with and trained alongside and covered night shifts for, being told he had sold them. "The audit is conclusive, Mr. Reed." Director Harmon's voice carried the practiced evenness of a man who had delivered bad news so many times it no longer felt like news to him. "The tracking records show your access codes at every stage." Because I was the technician on call. Arthur kept his voice level. It cost him more than anyone in that room could see. "My codes are on every maintenance log in that wing. That's what my job looks like." "Your codes and no one else's." "Then someone used my codes." Harmon looked at him the way people look at a thing they've already decided the shape of. "I have 8 years here." Arthur took one step forward. Not aggressive. Just present. Refusing to shrink in front of these people, in this hallway, on the morning of his daughter's 7th birthday. 8 years without a single discrepancy. You can pull every report I've ever filed. You can call every surgeon who's worked with equipment I've touched. Not one of them will tell you I cut corners. Not once. Not ever. He looked around the hall, at the faces he recognized, the ones now studying the floor. Someone set this up, and whoever it was knew exactly how to make it look real because they knew exactly how I work. The silence that followed was the worst kind. Not disbelieving. Just unmoved. Harmon set a folder on the counter. The hospital is prepared to forego criminal referral if restitution is made in full. You want me to pay for something I didn't do? I want this resolved quietly, for everyone's sake." Arthur stared at the folder. He thought about fighting it, lawyers, depositions, months of exposure, while Emma waited at home with Mrs. Carey. He thought about the evidence against him, clean in the way that only planned things are clean, and the fact that he had nothing, not a single document, not a single witness, to counter it with. He picked up the pen. He signed. And when he walked out through those glass doors into the gray morning, the badge still clipped to his chest, because no one had thought to ask for it back, he had $13 in his wallet, and nothing else. 3 years of careful, joyless discipline. Every skipped dinner, every deferred repair, every Friday night he'd stayed home because the money was needed elsewhere, drained in a single morning to cover a debt that wasn't his. He stood on the front steps and felt the rain start against his face. For a long moment he simply stood there and let it. $13. The cake would cost $11. That left $2. Not enough for the bus. He started walking. 3 miles away, and an entire world above him, Elena Margot Voss was ending a phone call in the back of a car that cost more than most people made in a year, and she was not in a good mood. She was rarely in a good mood. That was not a character flaw. It was the operational reality of running a financial group that managed 9-figure portfolios, while simultaneously managing the quiet, persistent efforts of people who believed her position was something that could be negotiated away from her. Elena was 30 years old. She had taken over the Voss Group at 22, 8 years of fighting for something that should have been straightforward and never was. And the woman who sat in the back of that car now was formidably, exhaustingly competent, and almost entirely alone. The Voss Group bore her father's name. It also bore the weight of everything her father had left unresolved, which was considerable, because Aldrich Voss had been a man of enormous capability and almost no domestic conscience. He had maintained 2 families simultaneously for the better part of 15 years, with the casual entitlement of someone who believed consequence was for other people. His first family was Elena's, her mother, herself, a childhood defined by precision and high expectations, and the particular loneliness of a child who understands too early that her parents' attention is a finite resource being divided by invisible competing claims. His second family was Victor and Tria. Victor Aldrich Voss was 31 years old, Elena's age almost exactly, which told you everything you needed to know about the timeline of her father's second life. He had been Elena's assistant for 14 months. A decision she had made against her better judgment because the board had suggested it, and she had been attempting, at the time, to perform a kind of magnanimity she did not genuinely feel. Victor was intelligent, measured, patient in the particular way of someone who has been waiting a long time, and has made peace with waiting a little longer. He had grown up standing in Elena's shadow without being invited to stand there, and he had spent the intervening years quietly deciding what he intended to do about it. Elena had not yet found the right word for what Victor was. She was working on it. Tria Helene Voss was 28, the youngest of the 3, quieter than either of them, and in some ways the most dangerous because of it. Where Victor was visible, Tria was structural. She held minority stakes in 12 companies connected to the Voss network, including a private hospital group that had recently become relevant in ways Elena was still mapping. She rarely appeared in rooms where decisions were made. She didn't need to. Her influence moved through the network the way water moves through stone. Slowly, invisibly, and with results that only became apparent long after the process had begun. The car stopped at a light on Brennan Avenue. Elena's phone buzzed. Victor's name on the screen. She let it ring. She'd been thinking about the medical equipment contracts she'd asked him to review last quarter, the numbers that hadn't resolved when she'd checked them herself, the slight pause before his answers that she'd noticed and filed away. Victor's pauses were not accidental. Nothing about Victor was accidental. The light changed. The car moved. She was still thinking about it when the impact came. The sound of shattering glass first, then the force of it, then the strange suspended moment where everything had already happened, and her body hadn't been informed yet. The car spun. She hit the door with her shoulder. When it stopped, She was still upright, which was more than she'd expected. The driver was out immediately. The other vehicle, a delivery truck, red light, straightforward negligence, had already pulled to the curb. People were stopping. Someone was on the phone. The ordinary machinery of a road accident assembling itself around her. It took her 4 minutes to realize that in the chaos, someone had opened the rear door on the other side. Her bag was gone. Phone, die. Card, statue. The keys to the secondary apartment. Everything. Elena Voss stood on Brennan Avenue in the rain with nothing, and felt something she had not felt since she was 19 years old, and had understood for the first time that the people closest to you were sometimes the most precise source of harm. She felt completely, structurally exposed. The particular vulnerability of a woman whose entire life runs through devices and accounts and access, and who is standing on a wet pavement with none of them. She walked, because there was nothing else to do. She walked 6 blocks before her blood sugar dropped hard enough that her legs stopped cooperating, and she found a wall outside a convenience store and put her back against it and sat down on the concrete in a blazer that had cost $1,100 and was now doing nothing useful for either of them. She sat there and breathed and tried to think, and she was still there when she heard footsteps slow. Arthur Reid almost kept walking. He registered her peripherally, a woman against a wall, head down, well-dressed in the way that made the scene more dissonant rather than less. His mind was 4 miles ahead of his feet, rehearsing the version of tonight's conversation, where he explained to Emma why there was no cake, and he had almost resolved the problem of which words to use when something made him stop and actually look. He knew that posture, the particular collapse of someone whose body has outrun their resources and is now simply waiting for instructions. He had seen it in his own mirror in the months after Sarah died. Not grief exactly, but the physical expression of a person who has exceeded their capacity and has no more pretending left. He stood in the doorway of the convenience store and did not go in immediately. $13. He turned it over. $11 for the cake. Emma's face in the morning, the specific joy of a child who has been promised a thing and receives it. He had been carrying that image for a week, like something he was responsible for keeping intact. But this woman's hands were not staying still, and her breathing had the shallow, urgent quality of someone whose blood sugar had dropped below the line where willpower is relevant. He thought about Emma. He thought about Sarah, who used to say, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, very certain about this particular thing, that kindness practiced only in convenient circumstances was not kindness. It was performance. Arthur went inside. He bought the bread. He bought the orange juice because sugar was what the body needed first. He counted what remained, enough for a taxi, not enough for a cake, and he carried everything back out and set it on the ground in front of her without ceremony. "Eat first," he said. "Then get a taxi. Don't try to walk in this." She looked at the money. Then she looked at him. He watched her run the calculation he recognized, searching for the angle, for what he wanted, for the thing underneath the gesture that would explain it in transactional terms. He held her gaze and waited, and whatever she was looking for, she seemed to decide it wasn't there. "I'll pay you back," she said quietly. He nodded once and turned to leave. He was already gone before she thought to look for his name. But the badge was still clipped to his chest when he turned, and Elena Voss, who noticed everything, who had spent 11 years surviving on the habit of noticing, read it in the half-second before the rain closed around him. Arthur C. Reid, Senior Biomedical Technician. She broke the bread with hands that were just beginning to stop shaking, and she ate, and she thought about his face. Not the kindness of it. She had been given performed kindness by accomplished people her entire adult life, and she knew exactly what it looked like. This was something else. He had looked at her like she was a person who deserved to be looked at. Not a situation to be managed. Not a liability, or an opportunity, or a problem requiring a solution. Just a person. Elena Voss could not remember the last time someone had looked at her that way. She thought about the badge. She thought about the name. And somewhere beneath the cold and the exhaustion and the long, complicated list of things she would need to address tomorrow, something shifted in the part of her that had spent 11 years making absolutely certain it never could. The knock came at 7 in the morning. Arthur had been awake since 4:30, sitting at the kitchen table in yesterday's clothes, with a cup of coffee he'd stopped tasting, watching the early light come in through the gap in the curtains. Emma Grace Ride was asleep in the next room, 7 years old as of yesterday, 1 year older than the age she'd been when she'd stopped asking when Mommy was coming home and had simply, quietly, recalibrated. She had her mother's way of sleeping, one hand tucked under her cheek. Arthur had stood in her doorway for a long time the night before, watching her, not saying anything. There was nothing to say. He hadn't figured out what to tell her yet. About the cake. About the job. About the shape of what came next for two people, and a kitchen table and a stack of bills that didn't care about any of it. The knock came again. Louder. The knock of someone accustomed to doors opening when they approached them. He opened the door and stopped. 5 black SUVs sat along the curb outside his building, actual SUVs, tinted windows, chrome catching the early sun in a way that looked deliberate. Men and women in suits stood beside them with the stillness of people trained to be unobtrusive and constitutionally unable to achieve it. A woman in a dark coat near the second vehicle was already on her phone. Someone who was clearly an attorney stood near the third with a leather portfolio under his arm. And walking up his cracked front path, in a charcoal coat that probably cost more than 3 months of his former salary, was the woman from the alley. She did not look like the woman from the alley. The person he had found, crouched against that wall, pale, shaking, sitting on wet concrete with nothing in her hands, bore almost no visible relationship to the woman now approaching his door. This woman moved like someone who controlled rooms before she entered them, like someone who had made a decision and was implementing it, and the implementation happened to involve his front step. But her eyes were the same. He recognized those. "Arthur Reed," she said. Not a question. She had already done the work of knowing. "You found me," he said, because it was the only accurate thing available. Emma appeared in the hallway behind him in her pajamas, hair sideways from sleep, the stuffed rabbit she'd carried since she was 3 years old, tucked under her arm. She assessed the situation with the frank, unimpeded judgment of a 7-year-old who had not yet learned to pretend she wasn't looking. "You're the lady from Daddy's coat," Emma said. "He came home wet. He was sad, but he didn't say so. He's like that." Elena crouched to Emma's level, not the awkward performance of an adult managing a child, but the natural adjustment of someone who had decided the child was worth the full attention. "He helped me last night," she said. "I wanted to come, say thank you properly." Emma considered this with the seriousness the situation deserved. "Did you bring cake?" she asked. "It was my birthday yesterday. We didn't have cake." The sentence fell into the room like something dropped from a height. Arthur cleared his throat. "Emma, go get dressed, please." Emma went. Elena straightened, and whatever softness had been present for Emma's benefit was still there but reorganized now. Less warmth, more precision. The CEO had returned. She sat at his kitchen table without asking permission, and she told him who she was. Elena Margot Voss. The Voss Group, capital investment, private equity, medical technology. 9-figure portfolios. $40 million currently in the process of being approved for medical equipment procurement across 11 hospital networks. And a growing certainty that someone inside her organization had been running a parallel operation through those contracts for at least 18 months. Siphoning money through clinical supply chains with the kind of patience and technical sophistication that required both financial knowledge and medical expertise. Her financial team could read a balance sheet in their sleep. What they could not do was walk into a storage bay, look at a laser surgical unit, and tell her whether the machine in front of them matched the invoice it arrived with. "I need someone with technical expertise who has no existing relationship with any party involved," she said. "Someone whose assessment cannot be purchased or pressured. She held his gaze. Someone I have independent reason to trust. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Outside, one of the SUVs shifted. From Emma's room came the sound of a drawer being opened, clothes being sorted with the concentrated focus of a child who had been told to get dressed. "The company that funds City General," he said slowly. "That's the Voss Group." "Yes." "And the person who approved these contracts?" Something moved across Elena's face, controlled but present. The expression of someone pressing on a bruise they have already located and mapped. "His name is Victor Voss," she said. "He's my brother." She left him with that. And after a long moment, during which he thought about Emma and Sarah and 11 hospital networks and the particular kind of person he had spent 8 years trying to be, Arthur Reed said, "Yes." The work took over his days the way serious work always had, completely, and with his full cooperation. The Voss Group occupied the top 3 floors of a glass building on Meridian Street that managed to be simultaneously transparent and entirely impenetrable. The lobby alone was larger than Arthur's apartment building. He walked through it on the first morning in yesterday's clothes and felt every inch of the distance between where he was standing and where he belonged. And then he went to work anyway, because that was what he did. Victor Aldrich Voss appeared on the 3rd day. Arthur had seen photographs. Elena had briefed him with the efficient thoroughness of someone who understood that information was protective equipment. Victor was 31st, almost exactly Arthur's age, with a kind of physical ease that came not from athleticism, but from a lifetime of occupying spaces designed to accommodate him. He dressed with intention. He smiled with precision. He had grown up in the second position, watching Elena inherit what he believed should have been distributed more equitably. And he had spent the years since developing a patience that was not peace, but strategy. He entered the main floor with the unhurried confidence of a man arriving on familiar ground, and his eyes moved across the room in the practiced sweep of someone cataloging leverage points. When they reached Arthur, they stopped. Just for a fraction of a second, less than anyone else in the room would have registered. But Arthur had spent 8 years reading the small failures of machinery, the vibration that preceded a bearing collapse, the flicker that preceded a power failure, and he caught it. The face beneath Victor's composure, in that single unguarded instant before the composure reassembled, was not the face of a man encountering a stranger. It was the face of a man encountering a problem he had believed was already solved. "I don't think we've met," Victor said, extending his hand with an ease that deserved credit for its quality. "Victor Voss, Strategic Operations, and you're—" "Arthur Reed, Technical Assessor, Procurement Review." "Wonderful." Victor's smile didn't shift by a degree. "We can always use a fresh perspective." He moved away toward the coffee station, unhurried, already on his phone. Arthur watched him go and felt the outline of something large and carefully constructed becoming visible at its edges. The way you can sometimes sense the dimension of a thing before you can see the thing itself. He turned back to his screen and kept working. The procurement records ran across 14 folders and 3,000 line items. Arthur spent the first 3 days reading without touching, building the architecture in his head, learning what the system was supposed to look like so he could see clearly where it didn't. On the 4th day, he found the first discrepancy. By the 8th, he understood that discrepancy was not the right word. The equipment being invoiced as new surgical-grade laser units across 7 of the 11 hospital networks was not new. The documentation was professional and consistent, serial numbers plausible, certifications convincing to anyone whose expertise was financial rather than technical. But there were tells. Calibration tolerances at ranges new units didn't ship at. Firmware versions that didn't correspond to manufacturing dates. Weight specifications off by margins that had no innocent explanation. These were refurbished units, reconditioned from older stock, well enough to pass a financial audit, not well enough for clinical grade. He pulled the original model specifications and confirmed what he'd been suspecting. The base chassis had been quietly discontinued from the North American market, 5 years ago following a series of hardware failures. Not recalled, discontinued. Someone had understood the legal difference between those two words and used it with precision. A recalled product left a trail. A discontinued one simply stopped appearing in reputable supply chains. It had kept appearing in others. Arthur found the adverse event reports on a Thursday evening when Elena's office had gone quiet around him. 3 of them, filed from 3 different hospitals, each one describing the same pattern: resonator failure under sustained surgical load, the kind that degraded gradually, expressed itself unpredictably, and became apparent at the moment of least tolerance. He knew that failure. He had read its technical description 3 years ago, in a different context entirely, sitting in a waiting room with his hands between his knees, waiting for news that was already decided. He closed the database. He sat very still. He had known, in the abstract way you know things you're not ready to examine, that Sarah's death had involved equipment malfunction. The hospital had used language like unexpected complication and hardware anomaly. There had been a review. No findings. He had been too broken and too responsible for a 2-year-old daughter to push it further. And eventually, he had closed the door on that question, because the question was larger than he could hold and still function. Now the door was open, and on the other side of it was a model number he recognized. Arthur pressed both hands flat on the desk, the same gesture he'd watched Elena use across a table from him, the deliberate act of someone choosing to stay present rather than leave, and breathed until the shaking stopped. Then he opened a new document and began writing everything he knew, in the order he knew it, because that was what you did when the alternative was falling apart. He thought about Sarah. Not the end of her, the middle. The way she sat across from him at the kitchen table, and told him, with the certainty of someone who had thought about this carefully, that the invisible work was always the most important kind. That the person who kept the machine running was the reason the surgeon's hands could do what they did. That it mattered, even when no one knew it mattered. He thought about 11 hospital networks and the machines currently sitting in their surgical suites. He thought about how many people were in operating rooms right now, their lives depending on equipment that someone had decided was close enough. He kept writing. He told Elena everything except the part about Sarah. She listened across 2 hours on a Friday morning with the focused stillness she brought to things that mattered to her. No interruptions, no performance of reaction, just the quality of someone whose attention was a real thing rather than a social gesture. When he finished, she asked 3 questions, each one precise, and he answered them. Then she walked to the window. 80,000 per unit, she said. Across 7 confirmed networks. Possibly 9. And the funds route to Tria. Tria Selenvos, 3rd account in the chain, registered under the subsidiary structure of the private hospital group. Elena nodded once, the particular nod of someone receiving confirmation that was still worse than suspicion. They've been building this for 18 months. Victor on approvals, Tria holding the funds, the hospital network as the vehicle. She turned from the window. This is what they wanted the group for. Not the position, the access. The procurement contracts gave them a legitimate framework for moving money through clinical supply chains without triggering standard financial oversight. Victor is patient, she said. Not with pride. With a flat acknowledgement of someone who had grown up adjacent to a particular kind of danger and had learned over time to name it accurately. I'll have legal prepare the framework. You have 10 days. He was nearly to the door when she said his name. Arthur. She held his gaze for a moment, and for just that moment, the precision of her dropped back far enough that he could see the person underneath it. Tired and careful, and doing something that cost her. What I asked you to walk into, I understood the risk when I asked it. I want you to know that. He nodded and went back to his office. He sat down and looked at the wall, and did not open the adverse event database again that day. Victor found him on a Tuesday evening in the parking structure on level 2. He was leaning against a concrete pillar with his hands in his pockets, when Arthur came around the corner. Entirely at ease, positioned with the deliberate casualness of someone who had chosen the location with care and wanted the arrangement to appear accidental. "Working late," Victor said. "You could have emailed." "Some conversations are better without a record." He pushed off the pillar and took 2 unhurried steps forward. "I want to be honest with you, Arthur. I think you've earned that." The word earned was precise, not a compliment, but a measurement. "You're a man who's been dealt a genuinely bad hand, daughter to raise alone. No financial cushion, and you've ended up inside a family dispute that was never about you." Arthur waited. "Elena is capable," Victor continued. "I've always said so, but she's using you in a specific way, and I think you deserve to know what that way is. You're not a consultant to her, you're a mechanism. She needs something that looks independent so the board can't question her process. Once she has your report, there is no further role for Arthur Reed in the Voss Group." He paused. "She doesn't maintain relationships past their utility. You can verify that with anyone who's worked for her for more than 18 months. Victor reached into his jacket and set an envelope on the trunk of Arthur's car. "There's enough there to cover a year. You file an inconclusive assessment, you close your engagement, and you walk away with actual resources and no exposure. No risk to your daughter." He let it sit. "The alternative, you continue, you file what you're planning to file, and I make sure Elena receives the city general documentation before she hears your version of it. The original complaint, the witnesses, all of it. She will wonder, Arthur, that's not a threat, it's an observation. People who've survived what Elena has survived are constitutionally incapable of not wondering." The parking structure hummed around them. Somewhere below, a car door closed. Arthur looked at the envelope. He thought about what it actually contained. Not money, not safety, but the specific relief of a conscience that had agreed to stop. He had felt the edge of that relief before. He had lived adjacent to it for 3 years, every time he'd chosen not to ask the question about Sarah's surgery that he wasn't ready to answer. He thought about the adverse event database. 3 reports. 3 hospitals. The same model. The same failure. He picked up the envelope and held it for a moment. Victor watched with that unbothered expression, already 3 moves ahead, composing the contingency. Arthur set the envelope back on the trunk. "No," he said. Something recalibrated in Victor's face, not surprise, but the small adjustment of a man who had prepared for this possibility without quite expecting to need the preparation. "Think carefully about what you're protecting," he said quietly. "I am," Arthur said. "That's exactly why." He got in his car and drove for 40 minutes through streets he didn't usually use, taking the long way back to nothing in particular, and by the time he pulled up outside his building, he had made the decision that had been assembling itself for weeks. He was going to finish this. Not for Elena. Not to reclaim something from the people who had taken his job and his savings and 8 years of professional reputation. But because Sarah deserved a world where those machines weren't still running in surgical suites, and he was currently the only person alive who had both the knowledge to prove it and the reasons to care enough to. He sat in the car for a while before going in. Emma was at the kitchen table with her good-colored pencils, the ones reserved for things she considered serious, bent over a piece of paper with the focused intensity of a surgeon. Arthur hung up his jacket, poured a glass of water, sat across from her. "What are you making?" "A picture? For you?" She turned it around when he asked. 3 people. He recognized himself the way he always did in Emma's drawings, taller than everyone, slightly crooked, which he had long ago decided was artistic license rather than observation. Emma in the middle, hair in the 2 uneven pigtails that had become her self-portrait signature. And beside Emma, holding her hand, a woman with long dark hair rendered in careful deliberate strokes, her posture upright, her face drawn with a precision Emma didn't usually bring to secondary figures. "Who is that?" he asked, though he already knew. "Elena, tight. Simply. The way you say things that are just true." I wanted to draw her, so I did. Her hair is hard. It goes like this. She demonstrated a particular curving motion with a pencil. I had to do it 3 times to get it right. Arthur looked at his daughter. At the careful way she had placed that figure, not filling space, not an afterthought, but something she had thought about and decided belonged there. Emma, who had stopped asking about Sarah not because she'd forgotten, but because she'd found a way to carry it that didn't require words. Emma, who drew their family as 3 people, even when it had been only 2 for 3 years. He didn't say anything for a long time. "Can I keep it?" he finally asked. "I made it for you," she said, with the mild exasperation of someone explaining something obvious. He folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, against his chest, where it stayed. Emma went back to her pencils with the complete ease of a child who had finished a thing and was already somewhere else. Arthur sat at the table and understood something he had been carefully not understanding for several weeks. He was afraid. Not of Victor, not of the boardroom, not of what came next professionally or legally. He was afraid of the specific ordinary thing that had begun to exist in the margins of all of this. Elena at Emma's soccer game, leaning forward in her seat with an investment she hadn't been asked to perform. Elena in his kitchen on a Sunday morning, drinking bad coffee without complaint, asking Emma about school with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested in the answer. Elena's face when she laughed, which was infrequent enough that he had started noticing it the way you notice changes in weather as something worth registering. He was afraid because he had spent 3 years building careful walls around the parts of himself that hurt the most, and he had just realized that Emma had drawn a door in one of them. He didn't tell Elena any of this. He went back to work instead because he knew how to do that, and because precision was the only form of integrity he had left that was entirely his own. What he didn't know was that 2 days after the parking structure, Victor had retained a photographer. Not for the office. Too formal, too easily explained. Victor wanted the other moments. Emma's Saturday game, where Elena had begun appearing in the bleachers without announcement, 3 weeks running. The afternoon in the park where Emma had negotiated Elena into 20 minutes on the swings, while Arthur watched from the bench, with his face doing something that photographed with uncomfortable clarity. The evening outside the building when Elena said something that made Arthur laugh. The full, unguarded version that he almost never deployed, and she had looked at him afterward with an expression no reasonable observer would describe as professional. Victor reviewed the photographs and found them considerably more useful than he'd hoped. The board meeting was 6 days away. Tria had the shareholder proxies aligned, and now he had material that would reframe every decision Elena had made in the past month, not as strategy, but as sentiment. A CEO who had allowed personal feeling to compromise $40 million of procurement oversight. He didn't need Arthur to be guilty of anything. He just needed Elena to look like she'd lost her objectivity. In the folder beside the photographs sat the city general documents, the original complaint, the witness statements, the carefully assembled portrait of a man who stole surgical equipment and walked away from it. Victor closed the folder. He was, as Elena had always acknowledged, patient. He could wait 6 more days. The signing ceremony was scheduled for 11 o'clock in the glass-walled boardroom on the 32nd floor. 60 people. Press outside. Victor had chosen the venue deliberately, not a meeting room but a stage, because he wanted witnesses present when Elena fell. He had spent 3 weeks on this morning. The photographs were already distributed. The emergency shareholders meeting was already convened. Tria sat 2 rows behind him in the gallery. Tria Celine Voss, 28 years old, and constitutionally still. The kind of person who understood that the most powerful position in a room was frequently the one that appeared to have no position at all. She sat with her hands in her lap, and her expression arranged in a neutrality so complete it was itself a statement. She had always been better at waiting than Victor. She had learned it earlier, and from a colder teacher. Victor almost allowed himself to feel certain. He didn't notice Arthur walk in. Not as anyone's companion. Not as the man the press had spent 48 hours constructing into a headline. Arthur Reed walked into that boardroom, carrying a hard case and a presentation drive, and he introduced himself to the council as an independent technical assessor, contracted 3 weeks prior. Before any of this, before the photographs or the allegations or the first move Victor had made, the paperwork was dated. The credentials were verified. Every document in the chain of custody had been prepared with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the work itself was the argument and that the work needed to be unimpeachable. Arthur set up without ceremony and presented without drama. Equipment, serial numbers, firmware discrepancy analysis, regulatory documentation confirming the discontinued chassis, procurement records traced through 3 shell entities to a single account, adverse event reports, 3 of them, filed across 5 years from 3 different hospitals, each one describing the same resonator failure in the same discontinued model, currently sitting in surgical suites across 7 of the 11 networks under review. He laid them on the table last. He didn't mention Victor by name. Not once. He didn't need to. The initials on the approval records, VAV, did the work without assistance. Data, when it is accurate and complete, requires no editorial commentary. The room had gone very quiet by the time he finished. Victor was still upright, still performing composure, but something had shifted behind his eyes, the particular stillness of a man who has felt the ground change beneath him and has not yet decided how to respond to the new topography. Then Elena stood. She had prepared differently. Where Arthur had built his case from technical evidence and financial records, she had gone further back, to the night on Brennan Avenue, to the 2 men who had taken her bag and left her on the pavement in the rain. The investigation had taken weeks and had been conducted without Victor's knowledge, which was the only way it could have been conducted. The trail was thin in the places trails always thin when people with resources try to disappear them, but it held. It led, as these things do when followed with enough patience, to a series of small payments and a single instruction passed through an intermediary Victor had trusted too completely. The robbery had not been opportunistic. It had been commissioned, designed to leave her stranded, frightened, dependent, easier to manage at a moment when the procurement contracts were moving toward final approval, and an obstacle needed to be softened rather than confronted. She had been meant to feel alone that night. She had been meant to feel like there was no one coming. Elena laid the evidence on the table without theater. She had spent 3 weeks watching Arthur work, and she had learned, or perhaps remembered, from somewhere before she had built the careful architecture of herself, that the truth doesn't require performance. It only requires precision. Victor said nothing. There was nothing strategic left to say. When the security team reached him, he stood without resistance, and that, somehow, was the most revealing thing. The composure he'd maintained for years, the patience and the planning and the long, careful game, all of it arrived at this. A man who stood up quietly and allowed himself to be escorted out, because the alternative was making a scene in front of 60 people and several cameras, and Victor Aldrich Voss would not give anyone that. Tria remained in her seat. She sat for a long moment after Victor left, not defiant, not performing calm, simply present in the way of someone who has run out of moves and has not yet decided what comes after. She didn't look at Elena. She looked at the table in front of her, at the documents that had dismantled everything she had built from the perimeter, and something in the line of her shoulders said she had known, somewhere beneath the calculation, that this was always the more likely ending. Wow. She had built on Victor's confidence, and Victor had been confident in the wrong direction. The Voss family chapter closed not with confrontation, but with silence, which was, in its way, the more complete ending. The hospital staff meeting was held 4 days later in the main conference room, the same room where, 8 months ago, Arthur had been handed a termination letter and watched every colleague he'd find something else to look at. The head of administration stood at the front and read a statement. He had been appointed to his position by a man now under criminal investigation. He had signed documents he had been told were procedural. He had not asked enough questions and had not pushed back when pushing back was what the situation required. He said these things plainly, in front of everyone, because there was no version of this that ended with any dignity unless he said them. Arthur stood near the back of the room. He had not prepared anything. When his name was spoken, when the word exonerated was used publicly, in front of the people who had watched him leave, he felt something shift inside his chest that he hadn't realized he'd been bracing against. Not vindication exactly. Something quieter and more structural. The sensation of a weight, carried so long, it had stopped feeling like weight, finally, slowly, setting itself down. He thought about Sarah. He let himself do that completely, for the first time in a long time. Not the grief of the end of her, but the shape of the middle. The kitchen table. The coffee going cold while she talked. The absolute certainty in her voice when she said the invisible work was always the most important kind. She had been right. She had been right about most things. He reached into his pocket and found the technician's badge. Looked at it. Put it back. Not pinned to his chest, just back in his pocket, where it had been all this time. A private gesture for a private accounting. He didn't need anyone else to understand it. Emma's match was on a Saturday, which meant wet grass and slightly crooked goals, and the bleachers smelling of bad coffee and damp jackets. Nobody in that crowd knew who Elena Margot Voss was. Nobody connected Arthur to the coverage that had run for 3 days, and then dissolved, as coverage does, into the current of everything else. They were just two adults sitting side by side with paper cups, watching a 7-year-old in shin guards that were slightly too large play with the total unself-conscious conviction of someone who has not yet learned to hold anything back. Arthur had been failing to find the words for weeks. He had eventually understood that the failure was the point, that he had been searching for language sophisticated enough to protect him from the exposure of saying the thing plainly, and that the only version of this conversation that was honest was the one where he came without that protection. He said he had known for a long time, that he had said nothing because he had been certain, in the deep and stubborn way of a man who has been quietly told by his own silence that certain things are not available to him, that she was beyond reach. Not in the way of ambition. In the way of a man who had spent 3 years learning to want less, and had become very good at it. He said he was afraid. He said it plainly, because there was no version of this that worked if he left that part out. Elena let him finish. Around them, the crowd reacted to something on the field, and neither of them looked. Then she said he was the most infuriating person she had encountered in 30 years of encountering difficult people, and her voice was dry and almost annoyed, and she was already turning toward him when she said it. And what came next was not managed or measured or preceded by any of the calculations she had applied to every significant moment of her adult life. She simply closed the distance. Elena Margot Voss, who had spent 11 years keeping the world at precisely the distance required for safety, who had built an architecture of self-protection so complete and so refined that most people never noticed it was there. She reached across the space he had maintained for months and decided, without negotiation, that she was done waiting for him to close it himself. Emma came off the field 20 minutes later, muddy and entirely pleased with herself, and found them sitting with their hands loosely joined in the space between them on the bleacher. She assessed the situation. She did not ask. She processed it with the quick efficiency of a 7-year-old who had been quietly hoping for exactly this outcome for several weeks. And then she simply pushed her way between them and took both their hands at once and sat there with the satisfied composure of someone whose drawing had turned out to be accurate after all. The park, late afternoon, October. The light had gone, the particular gold of a year winding toward its end, long and unhurried, catching the edges of things and making them look like something worth keeping. Emma was ahead on the path, doing the thing she always did when given open space, which was to move through it as quickly and as fully as possible, as though the world were an invitation she intended to accept completely. She gathered wildflowers from the edge of the path, with the focused curation of someone taking the work seriously. Then she came back and stood in front of Elena and placed the crown she had constructed, slightly uneven, entirely intentional, on Elena's head with the gravity of someone performing an official ceremony. "There," Emma said. "Now we're a package deal, all 3 of us, together." Elena laughed. Not the measured, controlled expression she wore in boardrooms and press photographs, and the thousand managed interactions of a professional life conducted at high visibility. Something older than that. Something that had been living behind the careful management of herself for a long time, and had finally found the particular circumstance it had been waiting for. She looked at Arthur. He looked back. There were no words that improved the moment, so neither of them spoke. Later, after Emma had run ahead and the path curved, and the evening came in soft at the edges of the day, Arthur thought about a technician's badge sitting on a shelf at home. Not displayed, not hidden. Just resting there, the way a thing rests when it has done what it was supposed to do and doesn't need to prove anything anymore. He thought about Sarah, and the kitchen table, and the invisible work. He thought she would have approved of this, not the outcome exactly, not the way it looked from the outside, but the way it had been built. Not through strategy or leverage or the careful management of circumstances. Through the simple, repeated act of showing up as the person he actually was, in a hospital hallway where no one stood with him, in a rain-soaked alley where he had $13 and a choice, in a parking structure where the easy answer was sitting on the trunk of his car and he had put it back down. Emma's voice came from ahead, bright in the evening air. Daddy. Elena. Jai. Come see. Arthur Reed took Elena Voss's hand, and they went. The badge stayed on the shelf. The park went gold around them. And in a city that had taken a great deal from both of them and returned something neither had planned for, the story did what the best stories do. There is a version of this story where Arthur picks up the envelope. Where he decides the world has taken enough. His job, his savings, his wife, 3 years of building something stable from almost nothing, and that he has earned the right to stop. That version was sitting on the trunk of his car on a Tuesday evening, and it would have been so easy. He put it back. And Victor, who had spent 18 months building something intricate and patient, and very nearly perfect, lost everything in a single morning to a man he had dismissed as inconsequential. Not because Arthur was powerful. Not because he had connections or resources or anything Victor would have recognized as a threat. But because Arthur was the kind of person who could not be purchased, and that quality, the one Victor had no category for, turned out to be the only one that mattered. This is what people who build things on dishonesty never fully understand. They prepare for opposition. They prepare for exposure. They do not prepare for the person who simply will not stop being who they are, regardless of the cost, because that person makes no sense to them. Kindness is not softness. Integrity is not naivety. The willingness to do the right thing when the wrong thing is easier, that is not weakness. It is the only kind of strength that compounds, the only kind that builds something real, the only kind that survives contact with the truth. Victor built an empire on numbers that lied. Arthur built nothing except a reputation for being someone you could trust. In the end, only one of those things held. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Tell us what you believe about kindness. Tell us whether good people finish last or whether you've seen, even once, evidence that they don't. Like this, if it stayed with you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe, because there are more stories like this one, and they are all waiting for you. Thank you for staying with us. We'll see you in the next story.